Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. I'm Dan Scogan, your host for the Ag Innovation News Podcast. Guests on this podcast shed light on innovations in value-added agriculture, highlight important voices and work that's being done throughout the Minnesota ag sector, and educate the public about resources and organizations that support Minnesota agriculture. Today we're welcoming to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, Ariel Kagan, Climate and Working Lands Program Director with the Minnesota Farmers Union. Ariel joined the MFU team as a Climate and Working Lands Program Director in February of last year. Her background is in agricultural economics and policy, and she has worked across sectors to support farmers, climate resilience, and policy development. At Farmers Union, she also works on topics related to climate-smart agriculture, renewable energy, market development, and environmental policy. We're going to find out more about all of that. Recently, she also participated in the first in a four-part series that AURI Connects Webinar Wednesday is calling Climate Change Opportunities for Value-Added Agricultural Businesses. Today, I hope to have a discussion about the first in that series and a brief outline of some of the part 2 through part 4 that is coming up. Ariel Kagan, welcome to the AURI Ag Innovation News Podcast. It's great to have you here.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
And let's just start so our listeners get to know you a little better with some biographical information. Tell us a little bit about your educational background and a little bit about yourself.
I am born and raised Minnesotan, grew up in St. Paul. Spent quite a bit of time out east for college and then stayed up there for the first part of my career in Washington, D.C. And then, like all good Minnesotans, moved back with a husband in tow. And now we live in the Twin Cities and are actually building a house out in rural Minnesota, which we're very excited about. I have always been really interested in the way that our working lands affect our environment. And I think that started, even though I was a city kid growing up, I was a horseback rider. And so I spent a lot of time out in the country as a kid until I left for college riding horses. And we would ride through the neighboring farm fields. And our trainer would explain to us the importance of soil health and crop rotation. And this was a while ago, ahead of where we are now, where people are talking about that all the time. We would think about how all of that affected community and the water quality and the birds and all of the things that were happening. So from a young age, was very interested in these topics and ended up studying economics and then getting a graduate degree in agricultural economics, and have been really fortunate to find a fantastic position with the Minnesota Farmers Union in this new program area around climate and working lands, which is all about those topics of how what we do with the land that we manage affects not only the future of that land, but everything surrounding it. And it's such an exciting time to be in this field because a lot of people are thinking about these topics now, and there's a lot of resources and a lot of new research happening. So it's been really fun.
Maybe put a little more meat on the bone with your title at Minnesota Farmers Union and talk a little bit about your role there and what your department or your role is in Farmers Union overall.
Minnesota Farmers Union is a grassroots member-based organization. So our members set our policy, and that happens through what we call county conventions that are held every year. We have a huge number of organized counties across the state, and right now is county convention season. So folks are getting together at farms, at kitchen tables, sometimes at a pizza ranch, and talking about issues that are important to them. They then pass resolutions at the county level that come up to the state. And at the state office, we work with a policy committee of our members to go through those resolutions. And then we have a state convention where we adopt the new policy every year that has come through from our members and those conversations. Over the past many years, climate resilience was one of the topics that kept on coming up across the state through those county convention processes. And it became a priority for the organization to make sure that farmers were at the table when climate change and climate change solutions were being discussed. And so the organization made the leap of starting this climate and working lands program area. And I'm very honored that I was hired to lead it and to build out this work. And it has been just incredible to see how much opportunity there is, how much enthusiasm there is from our members to make sure that all of these things that are happening with federal money and state money, private companies and nonprofits that are working with farmers to address climate change are representing farmers interests and perspectives and making sure that the farmer voice is at the table. So that's a lot of what I do at Farmers Union, and a lot of what Farmers Union does broadly is make sure that farmers are represented in policy discussions and any topic that addresses agriculture.
When you set out on your work for Farmers Union as a Climate and Working Lands Program Director, are you working on policy that your membership has already brought forward, or are you allowed to kind of look in the crystal ball and round corners a little bit and start to develop policy that you see emerging on a statewide, regional, or national level?
It's super important that our policy originates with our membership, but obviously things are moving really quickly, and those once-a-year policy conventions that our members hold sometimes don't keep up with the specifics of some of the policy changes as they're happening. So of course we have conversations with our members and our county presidents frequently about issues that are coming up. But a lot of our policy is also principles-based. So we support investment in climate resilience, like soil health and renewable energy. And so that's a broad value that then allows us as staff to go to the Capitol in St. Paul or work with our federal delegation to make sure that investments, new policies, and programs will be true to those values. So one good example of what that looks like in practice is our members are very supportive of investing in climate resilience. One thing that we have heard from our members is that soil health equipment is very expensive. So often to implement these new soil health practices, you have to buy a large piece of new equipment, like a no-till drill or something like that. And these can be upwards of $100,000. So we supported at the legislature in Minnesota a new grant program that helps farmers buy soil health equipment. And that's been a very popular program. And we've seen great outcomes from that program in getting equipment out that gets soil health practices on the land. So from the high level value of we support climate resilience to a specific program at the Department of Agriculture, we get to work on policy that really makes a difference.
And I'm going to circle back to that later on, I think, in our conversation, Ariel, but I just want to make sure that we're tracking properly for the people that are listening today. Typically, when there's policies, they become programs. Are there some pretty good programs already in place that MFU or you as a director are able to access that can help the entrepreneur or the producer?
Yes, there are currently a wealth of programs, you're right, and some of them are newer, like the Soil Health Equipment Grant. Some of them have been around for a decade now, like the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. At the federal level, we're seeing huge investments in new programs through the Inflation Reduction Act. And then we're also seeing a huge surge in private programs from companies like Truterra and Cargill. One piece of my job, certainly, and our work at Farmers Union is to navigate all these opportunities and make sure that we as staff are up to date on the details and the application windows and the requirements so that we can help our farmer members navigate these opportunities and make the most of them. I keep on joking that it's a busy time and it's a full-time job just to keep track of everything that's going on. And it's good because it's my full-time job. So that's something we spend quite a lot of time thinking about.
It's your full-time job, but how big a team do you have at MFU?
We're a small but mighty team, I would say, and punch above our weight. I don't know, there's a sports metaphor there that I'm probably getting wrong, but we're really proud to have great staff, of course, and then our members are very engaged and help keep us informed as well. So we're happy to have our government relations team, and then we've got an education team, we've got our communications team, but it's a small shop.
Of course, when you're working with programs and trying to help producers work through the programs, you're always going to run into some barriers. So in your work at Minnesota Farmers Union, have you been able to identify where some of those policies need updates, need some tweaking that could better serve the producer if they were changed a little bit? And do you get to have that voice at the national level or the state level?
Yes, absolutely. I think somebody who nerds out on policy language, when you look at legislative language and what gets passed into law, a lot of times what's in the actual language is very brief. And these are large bills that get passed, but the actual program language might be a paragraph. And then it's up to the department or agency to take that language and turn it into a program that works. And our Department of Agriculture does a great job of working with stakeholders to make sure that the programs are well designed and will work the way that we want them to. But you can't always think of everything from the get-go. So there are a lot of programs, especially at the federal level, where they're building programs to work for farmers of every commodity and every type, and sometimes that can be hard to do, where we do a lot of advocacy on improving how those programs work. So some of those at the federal level include the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Program, which is a crop insurance product for diversified farmers. It is a very promising program, but it's got a lot of barriers for the kinds of farmers that ideally would be using that crop insurance. And so we've been working with our members and with our partners at the National Farmers Union to improve that program. There's another one, also Farm Bill program, the Rural Energy for America program, or REAP, which is a fantastic program that helps to support renewable energy on farm, but has some issues that also affect mid-size or smaller scale farmers. So we think a lot about that. And the reason we are able to do that is because our members feel very empowered to pick up the phone and call us and tell us when they're filling out an application or they're learning about a program and they say, well, this doesn't make any sense. And that's so important to hear from the people who are actually using the programs, because something can look really good on paper and then it turns out, oh, this is just not how that works in real life. So our membership is extremely adept at identifying those issues and then working with us to raise those issues up to decision makers that hopefully can change that and make improvements.
Unfortunately, as we sit down to have this conversation today, once again, the National Farm Bill is bogged down. How critical is it to get that passed in the work that you do?
It is getting to be the second half of 2024, and we're still waiting on the 2023 Farm Bill. So it is much overdue. We're expecting likely another continuing resolution at the end of September when it expires. It is incredibly important to pass a farm bill, but it has to be the right farm bill. So we can't just pass a farm bill for the sake of passing it. We need to make sure it has the components that we need to ensure a strong farm economy and a strong nutrition program. For your listeners who may not be as familiar with the Farm Bill, it's a massive piece of legislation. It's passed about every 5 years, although I think that there's only been a handful that actually have been passed in those 5-year intervals, but we like to say every 5 years. And it combines programs like rural development and electricity programs, as well as farm programs like crop insurance and different grant programs that support conservation. And then the nutrition program, the SNAP program, or formerly known as food stamps. So it's a really important piece of legislation. There's some really needed updates because the last Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, the world has changed quite a lot since then. So our partners at National Farmers Union are working every day to ensure that we get a good Farm Bill written and passed. There's some hope, chatter, that after the election this year, we may see a Farm Bill make it through. We'll see.
We certainly will. I want to remind our listeners today that you're listening to the Ag Innovation News podcast, and we are visiting today with Ariel Kagan. She is Climate and Working Lands Program Director with the Minnesota Farmers Union and is involved directly with producers. And Ariel, I want to continue on that before we turn to the webinar that you were involved with recently at AURI. But just so that our listeners know, you mentioned that producers will contact you as they try to work their way through some of the programs and policies that they're hoping will help them. So you're working directly with producers. Are you also helping farm management teams understand these programs? Is there quite a wide network that's all kind of pulling in the same direction?
Absolutely. One of the things I'm really proud of that we've done at Farmers Union over the past year is to start up a working group in Minnesota that is focused on the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodity grant program that the USDA launched in 2023. And that is a historic grant program from USDA to invest in these climate smart commodities, so agricultural products that have climate benefits. It was an investment at the national level of $3.1 billion and 141 projects. And of that 141 projects, 30 of them are active in Minnesota in one way or another. We brought together all of the organizations that are either involved in those projects or who are interested and affected by those projects. And we've got a pretty impressive list of organizations that we've engaged, everything from the commodity groups to environmental organizations, folks at the University of Minnesota, businesses, and state agencies. And it's been really important in that work to partner to host this working group with the Nature Conservancy and Minnesota Milk and have all of those perspectives represented in trying to figure out how to make the most of this huge opportunity for Minnesota farmers to implement conservation practices and be rewarded through these grant programs. That's one thing that I think has had really important outcomes just in terms of getting everyone talking about some of the challenges of this program and some of the real opportunities that we're seeing and the lessons that we're learning about how farmers can be part of the climate solution. I would also say our members, they call me, we do Zoom calls with our members, we have our magazine. The commodity groups and other farm organizations are also doing a great job of helping their members to navigate these programs. And we have worked very closely with the Minnesota Corn Growers Association, Minnesota Soybean Growers Association, and the Minnesota Biofuels Association to stay both up to date on what's happening with all of these new investments in clean fuels and low carbon intensity fuel, and then to provide information to our members through that partnership. So partnership with other organizations is incredibly important at this point, where we're all figuring out how to make all this work.
And as I hear you say that, Ariel, it just reinforces my idea that you're all in the ag sector and you're all trying your best to move good policy, good programs forward. And it really is some teamwork going on behind the scenes that maybe people don't always realize.
Absolutely. We're really fortunate in Minnesota to have a fantastic landscape of ag organizations, from Farmers Union, Farm Bureau, commodity organizations, a number of other organizations serving farmers across the state. And we don't always agree on everything, but we do all agree that farmers should be at the table and that we should make sure that making policies that make it easier to farm and to become a farmer and not harder.
As I listen to you talk about your job, you start with challenges that become opportunities. So if a producer is listening to this conversation today, what would you like them to know, or what do you think they should know about taking a challenge that's in front of them and creating an opportunity? What's important for them to know?
I think we're at this incredible point of transition of how agriculture plays a role in solutions to these grand challenges that we face. So I would say that a big picture scale, the last century, the grand challenge for this planet was, how do we feed a growing world? And farmers rose to that challenge. We still have a significant problem globally with hunger, but the percentage of people who are hungry has dropped. And we have been addressing hunger on a global scale. And a lot of that is because American farmers and farmers around the world were able to increase yields, increase productivity, create new trade relationships, invest in research and development. And we really were able to address that big challenge that we all wanted to address. I think in this century, the big grand challenge is climate change. Our climate is changing. We can still do something about it to make sure that the future is something that is recognizable to us who grew up in this time, and that we can keep on growing food and fuel and fiber in this part of the world. So figuring out how to do that will require all the same tools that we used in the last century. So research and development, investments in new practices and new approaches, new management tools. And so it's a really great time for farmers to think about the goals of their operation, whether that's water quality or quantity management, if they want to replant their trees and their buffer strips, if they want to think about biodiversity, if they want to think about soil health, and then find a program or an organization that's doing that kind of work and work with them to implement those practices. I always say it's not a good idea to chase the money, right? There might be folks out there saying, here, you can get paid this amount to do X, Y, and Z on your farm. You should really figure out what the goals are for your farm and then find a program that fits for you. And I always point folks to the Minnesota Ag Water Quality Certification Program. It's a state program run through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. It's entirely voluntary, incentive-based program where you get one-on-one technical assistance with a certifier who comes out and walks every field with you, looks at your resource concerns, and helps identify some areas where you can improve practices or change practices to have a positive impact on water quality. And a lot of those practices have climate benefits as well. Sort of a long answer, but I just think it's such an exciting time, and that, yeah, it's all about opportunity right now, and things are changing quickly, and that can be a little scary, but I think mostly a very positive thing.
Another piece of the equation for me is more and more I see corporate America wanting to look and sound green, renewable, resilient. Are they doing a good job of meeting some of those benchmarks?
The private sector has really stepped up. Historically, the United States was a part of the Paris Climate Agreement. The United States withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. And at that point, hundreds of Fortune 500 companies and other companies stepped up and said, well, we're going to stay in the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement was not really designed for private firms, right? It's an agreement that is through the United Nations. It's a nation-to-nation agreement on reducing emissions in line with the target of a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming pathway. And so these companies had to figure out quickly how to actually operationalize these new commitments that they had made to that 1.5 degree Paris pathway, is what it's called. I think there's been some really impressive investments in both programs and approaches, as well as partnerships, companies working together to try to work on a landscape level rather than just through one individual supply chain. But there's still a lot of room to go. And I think there's a big question about accountability and how do we, with these private programs, make sure that farmers' voices are represented and that these programs are going to be fair to farmers. So we see a lot of consolidation in the ag industry. And I imagine as this market for climate smart commodities continues to grow, that we may see that same consolidation in that market as well. So that's something we're thinking about, is how are these private companies creating essentially new regulatory structures? They may not be government regulation, but they are a form of regulation if that becomes the expectation of what you're delivering to your grain buyer or livestock buyer. And so we're watching that really closely. But a lot of these companies have significant greenhouse gas emissions inventories, and they have a really important part to play in reducing emissions overall. So I think it's hopeful with a grain of salt.
Ariel, you recently participated in an AURI Connects webinar called Climate Change Opportunities for Value-Added Agricultural Business. AURI is all about value-added and entrepreneurial work on new products and processes. What was presented in that four-part series that you participated in?
We had a great conversation. We were joined by someone from the state climatology office, and we're really lucky in Minnesota to have, first of all, great people in the state climatology office, as well as really good data about our weather. Since I think the late 1800s, we've been keeping daily records. So that's a huge asset. So we heard about some of the things that have been happening in Minnesota with our changing climate. I think something that's really interesting is we hear global warming or climate change, and then we say, oh, well, it was cold this winter. We always get a lot of snow or a lot of rain. But I think what we hear from the climate scientists and the folks at the state climatology office is it's the long-term trends where we're seeing this change. We're always going to have volatile weather. That's part of living in Minnesota. There aren't many other places on the planet where you can go from 95 degrees in the summer to negative 40 in the winter. But it's the trends that we're getting warmer and wetter on average. And I think it's really helpful to have those experts tracking those data and figuring out how that affects our lives as Minnesotan residents and farmers. We also heard from somebody from the Center for Farm Financial Management about the economics of implementing some of these conservation practices that have climate benefits. So things like cover crops. The research is showing that they have really great benefits for soil health and water quality and quantity, but it's an expensive addition to a farm management plan. And sometimes the benefit to your yield and your profitability and the ability to cut inputs isn't realized for a few years after you implement that practice. And so the Center for Farm Financial Management and the Farm Business Management Program in Minnesota, again, a huge asset to the state, has been looking at the relationship between profitability and conservation practices. And they have a lot of great data as well about that relationship and some of the considerations. And that is really helpful to me and others like me who are working in policy to say, well, what would we need to do? What would we need to invest in to make this transition easier or make implementing conservation practices more economically viable for farmers? And then, of course, you heard from me about what's going on in the markets and what we're thinking about in climate smart agriculture from a markets perspective and from the farmer perspective. So it was a great discussion, and I'm really glad that you all are hosting these conversations because, again, I think we're at this inflection point with climate and agriculture where it's becoming a real business opportunity, and figuring out how to implement these practices and these markets is important. And also making sure that those markets have opportunities for all farmers and small and mid-sized businesses is also incredibly important.
And it was the first in a 4-part series, Ariel. What kind of information do you see coming out of the next 3 series in that webinar?
I think just the more detailed information people have so that it isn't just the big C word. I say it all the time, it's in my job title, but not everybody likes to say the word all the time. But it's not just about climate change. I mean, that's the big picture headline, but it's about all these different market opportunities, different scientific processes, whether it's the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle. And so there's a lot of complexity within the topic, and I'm excited to hear in the rest of the series about how folks are thinking about making an opportunity for value-added businesses out of this time that we're in.
Our time here is drawing to a close, but Ariel, I'm curious what you see as the next big thing that needs to happen to continue to drive some of these challenges to opportunities for the producer.
It's not one thing, and that is both challenging and gives us some room for creativity. So I think we are looking across the entire landscape, from policy at the federal level to the state level to the market development that's happening to how farmers are thinking about building in resilience into their operations. And this year we had historic rainfall, especially in southern Minnesota, and a lot of farmers unfortunately lost fields or parts of their crops to flooding. And that's where we can start to see the benefits of long-term soil health investments that can manage that amount of water. Maybe there's a certain amount of water that we're just never going to be able to manage. But this long-term resilience piece, I think, is really important. Another one that I want to mention that is different from the climate smart ag practices like cover crops and reduced tillage that we talk about a lot is the work that we're doing with the University of Minnesota West Central Research and Outreach Center in Morris on green ammonia. And we're really enthusiastic about this as an opportunity for Minnesota farmers because green ammonia can be a drop-in replacement for ammonia fertilizer, so anhydrous ammonia or urea, which farmers use. It's a key input for corn and small grains. But we're importing all of the nitrogen fertilizer that we're using at this point in the state from places like domestically the Gulf of Mexico states, but also internationally, China, India, Ukraine, Russia. And we don't want to be sending our money out to other places for these key inputs. And we can make those chemicals here using renewable energy, which is really important because globally, fertilizer accounts for 2% of total emissions, which is a really significant number. I mean, it doesn't sound like it, but if you think about, 2% of all the emissions on the whole planet are coming from creating ammonia fertilizer, that's pretty major. And if we can replace the fossil fuels that are used for that fertilizer with renewable energy and make a completely decarbonized ammonia fertilizer, that's a really exciting opportunity for the climate. It's also really exciting for the local production and economic value of having that key input made locally and distributed locally. And I think in terms of the markets and the value add, as more and more buyers are thinking about low carbon intensity inputs, fertilizer also makes up a significant portion. Up to 35% of the carbon intensity of corn comes from the fertilizer that is used to grow it. And so it's a little bit more in the upstream area than the rest of the work that we're doing, but we're very enthusiastic about it. And we'll actually be hosting a summit about green ammonia in Morris on December 10th. And we're really excited to bring together folks working in rural development, scientists, policymakers, farmers, cooperative members to talk about this opportunity and what it could really mean for the region.
Outstanding. So if we're going to leave them looking for more, Ariel, where can they go to learn more about Minnesota Farmers Union, more about the Climate and Working Lands program, or more about the summit that's coming up in December?
Our website is a wealth of information, so it's mfu.org. And we have our events calendar on there where you can see all the things that are coming up. We have a page dedicated to our climate and working lands work. And I would also plug that you can become a member of Minnesota Farmers Union. We have a deal right now where your first year's membership is free with an auto-renewing sign-up. And so that's an opportunity to give it a try. Then you get to receive our magazine in the mail, which is always fun, and get involved with what's going on in your county and your area. So mfu.org is the place to find it all.
Ariel Kagan, thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We've been visiting today with Ariel Kagan. She is the Climate and Working Lands Program Director with the Minnesota Farmers Union. I want to thank you for joining us today as well and for listening to the Ag Innovation News Podcast, presented by the Agricultural Utilization Research Institute of Minnesota. I want to thank my podcast crew, Lisa Martinez, AURI Communications Manager and Editor of this production. To learn more about AURI, you can go to auri.org.